Thank you very much indeed for having me. It's also really nice to see. It's becoming quite a little community, actually, right? After a range of these seminars, it's noticeable. So that's of great credit to the idea. As usual, there's a disclaimer at the very beginning, which is that if you really came to hear from me what the evidence is for particular programs that work in justice and security programming, I don't know. I don't have it. I'm not going to give it to you. That's not really what I'm going to talk about today. But what I wanted to do was, in a way, talk about a situation that we've all been in many, many times, which is that you have a discussion in a room, possibly with researchers and policymakers and practitioners, and if it's particularly heated, at some point in time there will be the question asked by someone, well, what's your evidence for this? We all know this situation, and then either that kind of breaks down the communication and that particular discussion, or it launches a debate on methods and things like that. But it's a really kind of, I've had this moment now so many times that people say, well, what is your evidence on this? And I think the thinking about a good answer to that question that is really quite a crucial thing, and I think one that the three communities that Pilar also mentioned don't discuss enough across their particular boundaries. So I'm going to try and at least get a start on that today. And of course, whenever we talk about evidence, you saw it in my title slide already, the word evidence was in inverted commas, because really, when somebody uses the word evidence, they always use it with a particular meaning in mind. And there's always this kind of, or very often, this inverted comma disclaimer that you've just seen. So what I actually wanted to do, just to start us off, is to get an idea from some of you in the room. If in your organizations this is a very hotly debated topic, I wonder whether you could share with us what the working definition actually is of evidence in your particular context, maybe contest too. But in that situation that I've just described, what is your evidence? How would your organization expect you to frame that or answer that? Yes, please.
Well, I come from a different discipline to the rest of you, but we would ordinarily have some sort of framework which is related to the sort of policy evaluation, if you like. And then we try and seek information that was relevant to each of those. And then we tag the information depending on whether it was empirical, whether it was judgmental, and so on. And you sort of proceed on that basis. So at any given time, you know where the gaps are, you know where the weak points are, and you know what your conclusions might be in terms of, like if you drill down, how secure they might be, or how insecure, depending on what feeds them and what the evidence base of that is.
So in some, very much based on the method by which the evidence was acquired.
Yeah, this is typically in a sort of military application, where you're trying to evaluate perhaps a future tactic or some future system or some combination of all those things.
Okay. Anybody else works with very strong rules or practices or evaluative framing? Yes, please.
I'm a lawyer, so we have very strict rules of evidence. The two main streams of evidence are factual evidence and obviously witness expert evidence. So that's probably the kind of categories.
Okay, so one thing that somebody says and another thing that somebody who should know says. Okay.
Well, I used to work in UN peacekeeping for 10 years and now I'm a consultant, but in peacekeeping that I know very well, there's no definition. So you have no idea what you're really talking about when you're talking about evidence. But there's a preference for quantitative information and data. That's the bias. And there's a drive increasingly to try and find perception and sort of personal, subjective sort of evidence.
Okay, but I mean, what I find striking, and it's not that surprising, is that the working definitions of evidence are very much focused on the method of how it was acquired. And that's very much, of course, what the mainstream discussion is all about. I mean, I put up this image because, of course, when you talk about evidence, if you look at, for example, DFID's documentations on evidence, they also have a hierarchy of evidence, and it's always focused on empirical evidence of a certain kind. It's broken down into, for example, primary experimental or quasi-experimental or observational, and then there is, of course, something that a lot of you might be very familiar with, the idea of the gold standard of evidence, which is kind of what you see on the picture, sort of. But really the gold standard dictates maybe that research design explicitly seeks to demonstrate cause and effect, and does so preferably by having an independent control group and so on, and ideally by constructing a counterfactual. So this is the gold standard, and this idea that you could have a hierarchy of evidence, that you could actually ultimately break things down and say this can allow us to speak with more confidence about a particular thing. But of course, in itself, looking at evidence as an empirical category is very, very problematic, and we'll talk about that hopefully in more detail, because of course we've already seen in the hierarchy of evidence not all empirical observations are equally convincing in themselves, but certainly not equally convincing to different types and groups of people. So that's a problem that comes up very often. And then in reality also, even though this idea of the gold standard of evidence seems like a very pure thing, of course lines get blurred all the time. I mean, maybe in peacekeeping it's particularly extreme that there isn't a definition, and presumably everyone sort of fashions one as they need it and as they go along. But of course, even in reality, the lines between empirical observation and maybe somebody's thoughts and somebody else's ideologies and theories that aren't proven in any way get very much blurred. And of course, you have that phenomenon that sometimes numbers and ideas get repeated so often that they simply become fact in the echo chamber. And I'm sure if we were all to make a pact tonight to establish a particular piece of information, and as a concerted effort carried this through our organizations, we could probably trace back when it would come back to us as evidence from somewhere. So obviously this idea of the hierarchy of evidence is already very problematic. And I already said when opening, when people speak about evidence, implicitly everybody has inverted commas around the word evidence, because everybody actually means something different. And so what we, a colleague and mine, have been working on trying to move away from this idea of talking about evidence and talking about a hierarchy of evidence based on the methods used to acquire it, because we don't find that actually very useful. Because you do also create boundaries between disciplines that way that we don't find very constructive. So what we've been trying to do is, rather than have everybody think something different, like the gentleman in the picture, when they talk about a particular topic or about evidence, is to look at evidence in terms of its usefulness and its usability for a particular type of decision making. So not whether this is gold standard, whether this was acquired through a particular method, whether this is quantitative or qualitative, but actually with the question, how can this evidence be used and what can it be used for in the process of decision making when trying to find evidence for policy making? So just a very brief overview, because I do feel very often that we are in a maybe time or a situation where evidence has often become sort of the policy kingmaker. If there is something that can be said that looks like evidence, then it's much, much easier to push an issue through. But of course, it's not clear what this evidence looks like. We've talked about this. So we think of the word evidence really just as an umbrella term. And the best analogy that I can use to talk about that is, if you talk about countries, everybody has a very broad image, and maybe somebody will, in their mind, boil it down to whichever country they have last visited. But actually, if you were talking straight away about Bhutan or Bolivia or Scotland, you would be very immediately establishing a different notion of what you're talking about. So this is how we look at evidence. It's just this umbrella term. It's like countries, but it actually doesn't tell you whether you're talking about Bhutan or Bolivia or Scotland. But these categories that we suggest, we think could help you to talk about specific countries. So the 4 categories that I will talk about are proof, possibility, principle, and plausibility. And then hopefully I'll get to speak a little bit about how this works in justice and security programming, or how it might work. So let's start with the first one, proof. Justine Greening, the Minister for International Development, in her first major speech after she took office, said that for her, DFID's main mandate was going to be to do the right things at the right time, in the right way, in the right places. And I think that's a really beautiful example of talking about very complicated issues as if there was proof that you could do something in the right way, at the right time, in the right places. What did I forget? In the right time. But implicit in this ultimate knowledge that you would actually be able to find out what the right thing is at the right time in the right place is also the notion that you can have information that guarantees you future success in something. And I often come across this idea of evidence, particularly when people talk about evidence-based policy. It's almost they look at information about something that has happened in the past as if it could guarantee success in the future. And that's very much reminiscent for me also this idea of proof of how you talk about evidence in a courtroom, of course, that once the judgment has been passed on whether this evidence is valid or not, you can't go back on it. It doesn't. This has now become proof. But what that means in practice when people talk about evidence-based policy is that often the argument would be, well, we've had convincing evidence that this particular policy worked well in Sri Lanka, so it will work. We have proof that this can work going forward. But of course, in reality, it doesn't. It doesn't guarantee that it will work again in Sri Lanka. It doesn't guarantee that it will work in Sierra Leone. It maybe this was a one-off shot. It doesn't. It's not entirely not clear. But people talk about a lot of evidence-based policy as if the past could predict the future, and that's of course a really, really problematic thing. Because, of course, even gold standard evidence, even randomized trials, if you can conduct them ethically on some of the issues that are really complicated, would never be able to predict in the future whether in a different place, in a different time, with different actors and slightly different issues, this would work again. So this idea of exchangeability, because something has been proven one, is really hugely problematic, and it seems almost obvious to say that, but it is striking how often in debates about evidence-based policy that notion still persists, as if really something could be waterproof. And I would argue very strongly that particularly in issues of justice and security, that idea of proof for something we could really push out the window entirely. So if we go back to this situation where somebody says, well, what is your evidence? I think a very good comeback in any situation like that would always be, well, I don't have proof, but to just dismiss this notion that evidence needs to be watertight. So just to sum up on proof, really, I think it's important to push back at all times that there's something like proof in justice and security programming, because it contradicts everything we know about social science, it contradicts everything we know about context, sensitivity, and all these kind of things. And it's just an interesting side effect, really, to me, that the debate on evidence-based policy has pushed this idea of proof so much. But I don't know whether I saw some people nodding and some people looking a little bit more skeptical. I don't know whether you have come across a situation that you would be comfortable sharing, where you felt that you've been put in a situation to look at evidence for particular programming in a justice and security field as proof, and what kind of debate ensued from that. Is this a situation that you can relate to at all?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think a standard different business case does that all the time. And essentially what you're asked to do is quote an example of this having worked somewhere else, and that becomes sufficient evidence to pursue a program choice without necessarily any comparison of the difference in context between the companies.
Yeah, true. I forgot about the business cases. I know. Sorry. Yes, please.
I don't want to take it to concern, but there is a way of attempting some sort of validation, and that requires at least some modelling. We'll give you an example. McKinsey Corporation gave an interesting paper at a conference I was at, where they took the historical analysis of two insurance companies with different policies, effectively, a similar sort of footprint. And one of them grew to become very popular and successful, and the other one disappeared. And they examined those trails of evidence, if you like, and they tried to pull out the main factors, maybe about 4 or 5 factors, that actually drove the decisions leading in various directions. They then uplifted that into a system dynamics model. They reran the model in order to be able to at least demonstrate that it could have the variability, if you like, to run those two cases. So it's not brilliant, but it's better than nothing. And then, of course, they were hired by all sorts of insurance companies on the
Really?
basis of their work.
Interesting. I mean, of course, maybe we'll have time later to talk about modeling and justice and security programming, because that would be very interesting. Anybody else has grappled with proof? So proof is one way of talking about evidence. The second way of talking about evidence, I think, is possibility. And possibility is an interesting one. And again, I hope we can come back to this with a bit more time later, because possibility really isn't evidence at all. It is the coming together with big ideas and trying to piece together, hence the many post-its on the picture, collecting ideas from many different sources and inspirations from many different sources, and putting them all together to develop a completely new picture. So, I mean, maybe in Diffid speak, this would be the big idea, something that so radically changes the way we've looked at things that it can't be evidenced yet, because it hasn't yet happened. Of course, in the evidence-based sort of proof-focused debate, the big ideas have absolutely no space whatsoever. I mean, in a way, the idea of proof also implies that you've reached the final truth about something, and it's kind of actually the end of research here, and we can go home and stop working. And possibility is the exact opposite of that. It's the development of big ideas, of ways of looking at the world that cannot be researched yet because they haven't yet been tested, they haven't yet been tried, or indeed if they're so big, then nobody has yet had an idea of how you could actually research things. But I would argue very strongly that keeping possibility in the evidence-based debate is really quite important, because otherwise, of course, you run out of ideas very, very quickly. If everything needs to be referenced back to something that has already happened, that has already been done, that has already been documented in a way that we at this particular point know how to document, it really runs big ideas about how the world can change run dry rather quickly. And bringing the idea of possibility in, and also with some sort of confidence to say we don't have any information yet, but it's a good way of thinking about some of these issues is important. I would qualify this pitch for possibility a little bit and say you can't just. It's not the same as blue sky thinking in a way. It needs to be kind of logical in itself and not damaging and so on. There's ways of thinking about things cleverly. You can still check assumptions. And you can still say, well, am my assumptions realistic, or am I completely ridiculous about here? But I think still bringing in some of these notions of allowing everyone to push the envelope a little bit can bring in some really interesting perspectives on some real-world phenomenon, particularly in these areas in which we work, which often are really indeed very hard to measure. And this is not a radical new idea from me or my colleague at all. But I mean, Bill Easterly, for example, very prominently always makes this point that in reality you have to have 10 big ideas, and then you have to try them out on 10 programs or 10 policies, and 9 of them will miserably fail, but maybe one will not. And that's how things change. And one of the things that I always find really interesting, because we're a community trying to bring different people together with different languages, I find that very striking always about the academic community. Because in a way, the academic community, you would think, is where the notion of possibility sits strongest and is most at home, because there's least accountability for things when things go wrong. But actually, the way it's been set up is very different. If you look at creative communities or very prominently software developers, the way they work is that they bring 500 people together in a room, and everybody comes with their good and their bad ideas. And through this process of osmosis, the better things filter through and the bad things get dismissed. Or in software development, very prominently, all of us are always beta testers for software developers, because they always released software versions with bugs. And then, of course, because millions of people are using them, they improve. And in the academic community, it works the other way around. So if you come with a new idea, then the setup is that your colleagues have to shoot you down in the most clever way possible. And it becomes a battle, actually, rather than trying to really understand what other big ideas are out there. And that I find striking, and maybe that's also something to keep in mind for this community, how that can be improved. The next way of looking at evidence I want to propose is something that I call principles. So now, of course, one of the really interesting things that might happen with the possibilities, the big ideas, is that they become entrenched, and then they become ideologies. and they become principles that underpin policies. And often this is when people very cynically talk about policy-based evidence, when actually the principle of an intervention or a program already exists and has long been decided upon, but then people go out and try to sort of find the right evidence to make it look as if it was based on evidence. But the reason why I think it's important to single out principle in the evidence-based debate is because it's just more honest. It makes clear if already a decision has been made, not necessarily which particular program can lead to an improvement, but a decision has been made on what would be worth improving. And of course, the very prominent debates about principle would be, in the humanitarian realms, of course, there's always the debate about, well, it's, the whole point of humanitarianism is to save lives, despite the fact that we know that often bad situations get prolonged by bringing in humanitarian and so on, humanitarian aid. The principle that underpins it isn't touched by the evidence that exists. Corruption is another very prominent example. We all know that corruption has some very positive side effects, but the UK government's principle will never be that they will start supporting some sort of corruption, right? The principle does always exist. So, of course, that's often comes from something that once upon a time was a big idea. And I think one that is very important to our work is actually, again, DFID's approach to security and justice programming. Because once upon a time, I think it might have been a big idea that security and justice programs contribute to building more stable states. Now that is absolutely a principle. It has become the underpinning principle for a lot of things. And actually a lot of evidence gets dismissed or put under the table based on this principle. All debates that we're all very much engaged in. For example, what do you do with non-state actors, security providers, who are providing much, much better security for local communities, but really do probably not contribute very much to building a more stable state in the model of the state that the UK government would envision. So you can see that actually the principle in security and justice programming sort of gets in the way of a lot of the honest debate. And I don't necessarily want to argue that it's not a good idea ever to work on a principle. That's not actually a judgment that I would pass as a blanket judgment on anything. But again, it's just a way of looking at evidence in a more honest way and saying, well, if actually the principle is that we believe that security and justice programs build a more stable state, then that's our starting point, and we shouldn't pretend that all the evidence that we have actually underpins that. Again, actually, I just wanted, because I'm nosy, this is a thing that I find very interesting, again, whether you in your organizations have encountered a shift from something that was once a big idea and that has now become absolutely common wisdom and really the underpinning principles in all the work that the organization does. And I don't know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe it has moved things along, or maybe it stopped things. Yes, please.
Well, I've been working on gender and conflict over several decades, and there's been exactly that sort of shift, which has been both good, positive and negative, because the fact that gender is at least accepted as being relevant to security and justice issues is a positive thing. But the way in which it is interpreted in ways which perhaps we'll be able to discuss more, that gender equals women and that women equals mothers and mothers equals peace,
yes,
is more or less, become now guiding principle.
Yeah, and from my experience, particularly in the gender debate, it's really you're inviting a lot of very angry comments if you challenge that idea. It's really a very difficult thing to challenge, or political participation for women and so on. Yeah, that's a very good point. Any others? No. You're all dying to go to the last one, right? To plausibility. So plausibility, I will talk about at length with using some examples, because in a way that we think that that's the most important category, and that should actually be the category along the lines of which evidence should be debated. And plausibility is when it's plausible that things would correct at the right time in the right way, like the two trapeze artists. And plausibility, I think, is also it's a useful lens to apply in particular in exactly those situations when people are asking for proof on something. So it's not you can't prove anything. You can only argue that plausibly, based on what you know about a particular type of intervention, it could plausibly work in another context. But what's really not good enough in that is saying, because we know this worked in Liberia, plausibly it could work in South Sudan. That's again proof that nothing has moved in the debate. But plausibility means that it's a much more detailed look at the intended outcomes of a particular policy and how the activities that are being proposed, or program rather, how the activities that are being proposed to get to this outcome might fit into the proposed context. So there are so many very prominent examples of programs that are clearly not plausible, where people have clearly not looked at this chain. I mean, we had a very good example right there, actually. Equals mothers equals peace. It's not, there's absolutely no plausibility in there except a certain set of beliefs. Or the other one would be violence against women. So you have so many programs which are based on educating women about their rights if they suffer domestic abuse, which would always imply that the biggest problem that they face is lack of knowledge about their rights. It's completely implausible, and yet time and time and time again, these really implausible, seemingly evidence-based programs come through and through. So looking at the in a detailed way at intended outcomes and the suggested activities, and really asking why they plausibly would be able to achieve what is being thought they could achieve. That's a very good way, I think, of looking at evidence, and looking also specifically at evidence in justice and security programming. But this is really, it really comes with a health warning, because it's really, really time-consuming and difficult to do. And it really requires a lot of testing of one's own assumptions and all these kind of things that take up a lot of time, and often in the process of thinking them through are very, very unconvincing. Like in a business case, they look very, very unconvincing at first, even though ultimately they might save a lot of money and do much better. And I think what's important also for plausibility cases is that this can include a lot of different types of information that could fall short of the so-called gold standard, because it does mean that in plausibility you could also look at in some of the big ideas, how they would relate to specific programs. You could look at anecdotal evidence, not to say, we have this really rock-solid evidence, but to say, actually, from some of the anecdotal evidence, it could plausibly fit into this, like in this particular way. You could look at cultural expressions of a situation, which of course is always forgotten in the evidence debate. How is this reflected in songs? How are things reflected in pictures? All these types of evidence that in this very stringent evidence debate just fall under the table, but actually help paint a much, much bigger picture. And I think that's really an important way of thinking about information, particularly in situations when a lot of information that comes sort of through the straightforward evidence stream isn't actually very good. And I want to talk very briefly about two cases in which we tried to, two pieces of research that we conducted in South Sudan, where we tried to think about evidence in this particular way. So the first one is about the link between political accountability and mobile phones. And you can see a lot of love went into this collage, a lot of Googling of politicians with mobile phones. You can find amazing things, actually. So we did a piece of research where we basically looked into a very prominent chain of assumptions, which is in the ICT world very, very popular right now, which is that if you increase mobile phone coverage, you increase access to information. And it's always assumed that first of all, increases people's political participation and willingness to vote. And obviously, through more political participation and more voting, you increase political accountability. But also, the second part of this assumption is that with better access to information, and particularly two-way information, not radio but mobile phones, people will be able to hold politicians to account more directly. And so that's the direct accountability. And ultimately, that also creates better political accountability. So we went into in one state in South Sudan, and we looked at where's mobile coverage and where isn't, and we divided this into general coverage, which is with a problem-free reception most of the time unless there's a storm, and areas with no or sporadic coverage. And sporadic coverage would mean that in a village you could only have mobile phone reception if you climbed up on the hill or something like that. But it would require a lot more effort to actually get mobile phone coverage. I'll talk about this very, very briefly. If any of you are dying to see the regressions and so on, I'd be more than happy to share the paper, which is under review at the moment. But we found some really interesting things. So it was a multi-method research, qualitative and quantitative. And in the qualitative parts, we could see very clearly that when people talked about their memories and their experience of the elections, and this was the 2010 election in Sudan and then leading up to the referendum on South Sudanese independence in 2011. So in areas with good coverage, people talked about the elections quite regularly and unprompted, and always looking backwards and in a quite detailed manner of how bad the elections had been. So you see some examples here. So the experience of having gone through these elections as a process that actually was really not a very pleasant or very constructive one came through very clearly. And then in contrast to that, in areas with no coverage or sporadic coverage, it was actually very rare that people even commented on the elections. It wasn't very much part of the discussion about politics. But when they did, they had a very different view of elections, which was something really didn't go very well in those elections, particularly because of the way people who had been elected have behaved since. People have not come back. So there would need to be a new round of elections to rectify that things had gone so badly last time. So in the areas with a lot of mobile phone coverage, nobody suggested that actually the next time round things would be a lot better. And in areas with no mobile phone coverage, people still kind of believed in the tool of elections, if you want. So that in itself was quite interesting. But then we also wanted to know how this actually how this would translate into future activity. And I apologize, I forgot to make this font white. So what we actually see is that people in areas with general phone coverage and very bad experiences of elections weren't really that bothered about voting in the next national elections, and people in areas with sporadic coverage were still quite enthused about it. So you can see that actually already this assumption that mobile phone coverage leads to better information, leads to better participation in voting, that already breaks down immediately. So that doesn't work at all. And of course, then the political accountability side of it doesn't work at all. There was an interesting thing about the link between more information and the direct accountability, because one of the things that was also very striking in the qualitative findings was in areas with no mobile phone coverage, when people talked about the government, on the one hand they said, well, if we have better elections next time we get a better person. But on the other hand, these were also areas where people talked about the government in a really quite devastating way, to the point where they said, we actually think we're so isolated here because the government wants to kill us. So there was a very direct assumption that the government wasn't just neglecting, but was actually actively trying to do something bad to these communities. And that wasn't so at all so prominent in the areas where people had mobile phones. So there was a lot more understanding that government couldn't deliver on everything, and there was a very clear sense that this government wasn't doing very much, but not that they were actively hostile. And we actually think that's quite a significant difference. So what we find there is we find no proof at all that increased mobile phone coverage does all these things that are assumed, but we do find some plausibility that actually something happens in this process of being connected. So that's already quite interesting. But to take one step back, of course, the entire setup of this kind of question starts with the very principled idea that more information and more technology is always better. So that is sort of underpins this. So that it's just sort of as an example to also show you how actually you need to pick apart the various aspects of particular stages of a research to understand where the interesting findings are. What was very clear across the board, no matter whether people had mobile phone coverage or not, was that nobody was very satisfied or very impressed with the government response to anything. So what does this mean for programming? One of the really important points, and it's an obvious point to make, and it's made very often, but it's not made often enough to my taste, is that actually, as soon as you look into particular programs, it is really important to look at all the other bits and pieces that feed into the plausibility. So what we find in this particular piece of research is clearly there's something going on with information and with mobile phones, but that breaks down immediately if the focus is only on increasing mobile phone coverage. Because if structures of political accountability don't exist, like for example, the assumption is always that once you vote, politicians behave better because they want to be voted back into office again. Well, but if you don't actually, first of all, ever see the politician, or secondly, you don't know whether you will ever vote again, simply assuming that mobile phone coverage increase will lead to all these political accountability effects is at best naive. But it still is always sort of cited as one very effective intervention. The second very brief piece of research I want to talk about was we conducted in the same area, and this is also connected to media, but this time it's about radio. So one very prominent way of, particularly in northern Uganda, in dealing with the Lord's Resistance Army, has been to broadcast radio messages to combatants, the so-called come home messages, so it's quite self-explanatory what these messages say, to ask them to return home. And this has been an approach for many, many, many years in northern Uganda, funded by DFID for a very, very long time, and this approach now continues that the Lord's Resistance Army has left northern Uganda many years ago in areas where they now are, for example in South Sudan, even though there haven't really been LRA attacks for quite some time. But the general sort of wisdom about these come home messages is that they're incredibly effective at ending violence. And one of the organizations very prominently supporting this, not just ideologically, but also with funding and building radio stations and so on, claims that 89% of ex-LRA said that coming home radio messaging influenced their decision to escape. So that's a pretty convincing piece of evidence. Of course, that they use it as proof here, but if you look into the numbers, it immediately becomes clear that it's pretty shoddy, because the amount of people that were asked on this were exactly 36, I think, who came back. And of course, there was no control group, because nobody asked everyone who didn't come back why they didn't come back, even though they might have listened to the radio messages as well. But anyway, the claims of success are very, very prominent. And again, they work on a certain assumption what happens when people hear these radio messages, but they also make broader claims, and this is where it becomes very interesting, which is that these radio messages and having access to more information about LRA movements and so on is also beneficial for the civilian population. And the claims that they actually make is that it makes people more secure. So it becomes part of a protection strategy to have access to information. So you can see here, again, the chain of this assumption is that the more information you have, the better is your security. That already becomes quite dodgy, but what we find in some of the research that we did is, of course, that doesn't work at all, for the very similar reasons that simply increasing mobile phone coverage doesn't improve political accountability. Because unless there are other mechanisms in place that support action based on information, security doesn't improve that way. So what we actually find is that the more information people have, the more they are afraid. The less they are willing to return back to their everyday lives, even though there haven't been attacks for many, many years now. So actually, rather than increasing security, information increases very directly the feeling of insecurity. And then there's an interesting knock-on effect, and this is again when we come into trying to think about plausibility, which is that we see that in areas, and we tested this again by looking at areas that had radio coverage versus areas that didn't, and the finding that people in areas with radio coverage were much, much more scared of an attack and much less willing to move back to their villages, even though they had no attack at all. Was very striking. But what was also very striking was that in those areas where people had listened to the radio and were more afraid, they were also a lot more supportive of their local protection militias and a lot more distrustful of the government army, the UN forces, and the various other international forces who rock around in that part of the world. Whereas we didn't see in areas where people had less access to information, they weren't as afraid, and they weren't as opposed to government, and they were, they were very aware of their local protection militia, but they didn't have such huge trust in them. So again, it's an interesting model that underpins this, because of course the whole idea would be that if you bring in more information, people become more active, politically responsible citizens, and ultimately the idea would be that that builds a stronger state and all these kind of things. But what we actually see is that it destabilizes the situation and people's perception, and it supports non-state actors. So really a quite different effect. And I just wanted to show you this because it makes kind of clear why this information is so problematic. So you can see where Yambio is, that's where the radio station broadcasts from, and all the yellow dots were LRA activity at the time when we did our research. And this radio station broadcasts where you see, sort of northwest, where you see the red circles. And you can see that red means that people are very often afraid of an LRA attack. And you can see from the activity that actually they wouldn't need to be that afraid. But because they hear these messages all the time, which, by the way, in South Sudan, it's very unlikely that any LRA fighter will ever hear them since they're not there. But because people hear them all the time, they become very, very afraid. And it's interesting to see that there's no connection to proximity to LRA effects. I mean, the really striking one is the one at the very top left, where people are only sometimes afraid of LRA, even though there was quite recently was an attack. So you can see how actually the picture becomes a lot more complex and not quite as straightforward. And this is just, again, to show you how the trust in this local protection militia and the Arrow Boys grows in areas with radio reception versus the trust in the SPLA. So you can see that this is only, without a doubt, one of many ingredients that shifts distrust or trust from a government army that wasn't very trusted in the first place. So this is also a bit tricky. But you can see that this is obviously might have an impact. But again, do we have proof that it has an impact? No, of course we don't. Is it plausible? Yes, because a lot of the findings sort of interlink quite plausibly. So if really in areas where people have radio reception, they are a lot more afraid and they trust the Arrow Boys more, it's very plausible that something is going on there. But again, did we touch the principle that information is a good thing? No. I mean, will we ever say it's better to keep people in complete ignorance, even though they're in a precarious security situation? No, it's very impossible. So, but again, you can see how actually looking at evidence in a much more holistic way from these perspectives might give you very different insights. So I was asked to talk about what works in justice and security program, and I started by saying I really have no idea what works. But I think this is another image that I just want to use to start off the discussion, because I think often when this question, what works, is asked, and as DFID is now putting out so many calls for proposals about what works and this, there's always this notion that we can find out in the lab setting, in the kind of clean, we can understand where all the actors are and how they react at all times over a long period of times as the world changes around them, but what works stays the same. But I think in reality the other image is a lot more useful to keep in mind when you ask, well, what works? Because we don't really know. We've not learned to record change, ongoing change, dynamic change in research very well. So, which is not to say that it's not useful to look at what information exists, but to look at information with the idea that it's easy to pinpoint what works in a laboratory-like setting and to establish proof that would make for a very impressive business case. I think it's really quite problematic. So with this, I would be very, very keen to hear your thoughts on this approach. Thank you.